Hey, it's Broken Office Chair, a podcast produced by Alternatives. Broken Office Chair is hosted by Alternatives Executive Director Bessie Alcantara. Bessie is a Chicago native, first-generation Salvadoran Mexican-American who's passionate about dismantling systemic racism. In each episode, Bessie will be joined by her friends and colleagues who are ready to speak candidly about their experiences as people of color in their various professions. In the episodes, they'll address topics such as issues in the nonprofit sector, racial equity, DEI in practice, and much, much more.
Today, I am joined by Frances Kunreuther, the co-executive director of the Building Movement Project, and Mercedes Brown, the race equity assessment director at the Building Movement Projects. I keep saying that wrong. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Great to be here.
So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a huge fan. So I'm excited to have you both. And one of the things I wanted to say is that I took over in December 2018, for an executive director who was white and who had been with the organization for about 38 years, I believe. And so when I read your reports, I felt very seen and validated in my experience. And it was the first time I had seen some framing around it. And I think that that's what had kind of the reason why I actively follow your reports today is because it was nice to be when I was going through that experience and talking to my board about my experience. It was nice to be like, and here's a report that validates what I'm going through and puts another layer of detail to it. So I just wanted to share that with y'all.
Thank you.
Yes, I appreciate that.
All right. So y'all have a new report. Blocking the backlash around DEI initiatives. So why don't we start off by you telling us what prompted that report to be created?
So I can start. This is Frances. We had asked, first of all, the Race to Lead survey series started in 2016. And our first report, really our question was, why are there so few leaders of color in the nonprofit sector? Just a simple question, something that we observed. We kept thinking there was going to be a change. The change wasn't happening. And that report really focused on that. And, as you know, being an executive director of color, it's not because people aren't qualified or well-trained. It's systemic bias. And our over 4,000 respondents helped us show that. In 2019, a lot of groups had started DEI initiatives. So we asked a few questions about DEI. And then in 2022, when we did the third Race to Lead survey 6 years later, we wanted to do some comparisons between 2019 and 2022. But what we realized we hadn't asked is, do people think different intervention strategies are effective? And so we were trying to answer that question in the DEI questions in 2022.
So when you did that study, what do you think was like your most surprising finding?
That's such a great question. And Mercedes, you'll have to weigh in too. As a writer, I think the most, for me, the most intensive finding was that people of color respondents did find these interventions effective, and it's very specific. And all if you compare that to white respondents, not that white respondents didn't think it was effective, but if you look at that very and extremely effective, it makes a difference in people's lived experience at work. And I don't know if that was surprising, but the data was so clear on that, and I think we didn't know it was going to be that clear that actually it does make a difference in and how you feel at work, if you like your workplace. And so that was really it just popped right out.
Yeah, Frances, the only thing I might add, Bessie, again, maybe in line with how Frances framed her response, I don't know that this finding was surprising, but it was actually validating, similar to how you described your early experience with BNP research. But the finding that there's this tipping point, so to speak, around the number of DEI strategies deployed in an organization and the impact that has on particularly like those early sort of late adopters, like the folks who might resist DEI initiatives and programs early on, but that when you reach a certain point, and for us, we identified that was 5 or more within organizations, that you saw that sort of resistance begin to dissipate, and folks really across the organization, regardless of whether or not they were BIPOC or white respondents, were able to appreciate the value and sort of receive the organization more positively, given the factors that we looked at. And so the one thing I'll offer to Frances's earlier point, so in my role as the race equity assessment lead at BNP, we work with nonprofits who are deploying DEI strategies like race equity assessments. And what we found more anecdotally within organizations is that for organizations who hadn't deployed as many, so maybe the race equity assessment was the first DEI strategy that they were using as an organization, that there would oftentimes be more pushback initially within organizations. But the more they sort of piled on, begun doing planning, engaging in training, being supported by skilled experts, capacity builders, DEI consultants, and did strategic planning that was tethered to DEI strategies and race equity strategies, the more that resistance, again, like we saw quantitatively in the research, we observed that qualitatively in our conversations, more in our anecdotal assessment of organizations as well. So again, not shocked by that finding, but it was helpful to see that bear out in our actual hard data as well. And Frances, I hope as Frances said, I am not on the research team, so I didn't co-author the report, but much like what you named, Bessie, really appreciate the impact of the reports that we produce at BNP.
So it's interesting because we have, one of the things we do, so we like to talk to other organizations about anti-racism, DEI, racial equity. And one of the key points on your report that I also want to dig into is that how DEI is not racial equity, which I really appreciate it. But we try to talk to orgs about it. So we have a training that we do that's anti-racism as workplace wellness, because we anecdotally have learned from our own culture, because we had to do significant DEI work. So, and more, is how much more workplace culture improved as we started moving along the spectrum of anti-racism. So again, when I read that, it's validating to the work that we're doing to see, one, that we are moving in the right direction, but two, that it's not enough to just stop at DEI. And so I think that was I want to talk about that a little bit. So one of the things, as I mentioned, that you specifically stated was DEI is not racial equity. And can you talk to me a little bit about, one, why you felt the need to say that? And two, what are you hoping for folks to get from that?
Well, I'll jump in on the data side. Well, first of all, we would, just as an organization and from Mercedes' work, we know that DEI is not equal racial equity. Racial equity is a structural, systemic issue. Individual DEI programs and organizations can really improve those organizations, but it doesn't dismantle the structural and systemic racism that people of color face, both in the sector and in the world at large. And we're very aware of that. But it doesn't mean that DEI is ineffective. It just means it is a step towards a larger dismantling of structural racism within nonprofits and an awareness of structural racism, which I think is even more, it's often overlooked. Like, that awareness does make a difference. And you can really see that in a question we asked. We asked in 2016, 2019, and 2022, how does your race affect your career advancement? Very simple question. So I'll give you the 2022 results. So in 2022, the response was 50% of people of color respondents said that at 50%, half of people of color respondents said that their race negatively impacted their career advancement. It didn't matter if you had one DEI initiative, no DEI initiatives, 10 DEI initiatives. It still, they still felt their race had negatively affected their career advancement. It didn't move the needle at all on that. It moved the needle in other areas for people, but not on that particular question. On the other hand, for white respondents, you can see the more DEI interventions, the more they can see that their race has positively impacted their career advancement. So it has an impact on the awareness of white respondents, but it doesn't change the reality of the negative impact of race on people of color respondents. So that's a structural issue. It's good that white respondents are more aware of that, but it hasn't dismantled that.
So what would you hope, knowing this information, what kinds of practices would you hope nonprofits engage in? I know I'm asking you sometimes something outside of the scope, but yes.
Yeah. No, I can. Well, Mercedes, do you want me to start or do you want to start?
I'm happy to jump in, Frances. So I think that, and the one thing I'll add to what Frances said, and I think that's right. I always, Bessie, given that I lead work at BNP that, again, speaks to one strategy, which is race equity assessment work. And so this question of DEI not necessarily being race equity is actually one that is more front and center for our work. And I think Frances's response was spot on. One thing that we always make sure that we lift up that sort of really builds off what Frances has said in response to your prior question, which is the importance of DEI being a starting point within organizations. I even reflect on my past experience working in county and city government, and I really I think this is huge, Frances's point around awareness building as a major starting point to even for organizations to start to put make structural process and practice shifts. They have to have base awareness of the degree to which white employees are benefiting from their race and the degree to which, like just to name two specific things for which groups would have growing awareness around, BIPOC respondents' race is having a negative impact on them. Like that starting and jumping off point feels so critical. And so I'll say for organizations, we do think it is important for them to jumpstart DEI and race equity initiatives that in part might include deploying race equity assessments in their organization so that they can better understand the extent to which they have strength in certain areas that are critical to just organizational development as a whole, but even more critical to shifting workplace culture in service of creating a space that feels inclusive, that fosters a real sense of belonging for all employees, but especially employees of color within the organization. So I'd be remiss if I didn't encourage organizations to consider race equity assessments as a DEI starting point, a race equity starting point within the organization that will certainly by design bring not only broader awareness around many of the things that Frances mentioned a moment ago, but also seek to better align the organization. And again, alignment to me feels like it's not structural in the systemic sense as like root cause issues, but structural in the organizational sense that are important and tie back up to policies and procedures and practices that aren't necessarily people dependent within the organization. So I would just, jump off this by encouraging organizations to consider whether or not they deploy their own assessments in a more self-guided capacity, or they bring on consultants and capacity builders who might help them externally in leading that work, that they might consider race equity assessment as a strategy.
Can I add one thing, Betsy, is that it's interesting the assessment that we developed, the building blocks for change that Mercedes is talking about. We look at changes, whether they're practice, whether they're intentions, whether they're practice changes, or whether they're structural changes within the organization. And we actually, through an algorithm, are able to assess whether the organization is actually talking about the change, their intentions, whether they're actually practicing some of the changes, and whether they've addressed the structural issue. And the structural issue is always the lowest ranked. People can have good intentions. People can start doing good practices, but really getting to those structural issues is hard. And we also need to get to them as a sector. It shouldn't be dependent on each organization to do this. We should really be challenging the sector to be more intentional about how it rates people, how boards assess new executive directors, about the type. One of the findings we keep having is white respondents have more mentors inside their organizations than people of color. People of color have more mentors outside their organization. They seek out mentors outside their organization, but they don't have them within the organization. Why are we still talking about that in 2024? That's outrageous. But that's a structural issue that you don't really notice. But that's not just one organization. That's across organizations.
So you're preaching to the choir. I love this, obviously. One of the reasons, though, right, that people hesitate to implement these types of strategies is the resistance initially. And so one of the findings that I really enjoyed reading about was the initial resistance specifically from white folks. And I think as a country, we've also been seeing that in different states and legislation initiatives, et cetera, right? So what do you think is contributing to that, and how did you see that kind of evolve?
Well, why don't I just start by talking about the initial resistance of white folks, and then Mercedes, you can talk more about what happens with multiple interventions. The finding that you're referring to is that we looked at organizations that said they had respondents that said they were in organizations with absolutely no DEI initiatives. Nothing's happening there. And then we compared them to people in organizations that had either 1 to 4 kind of strategies that they employed, like maybe training, looking how it is in their mission, diversifying their boards. They're different, that we had kind of 10 different strategies that people could employ. We compared that to 1 to 4 strategies, 5 to 7 strategies, and 8+ strategies. And this is what Mercedes referred to earlier in kind of your opening question. And, it was just absolutely consistent when there was no DEI strategy, that white people were pretty happy in organizations. They were just like that. It's working for me. And consistently, people of color, were less happy in those organizations. Like you can see the gap. We have kind of, you've seen the report. There are 3 charts. And people, if they want the report, they can go to racetolead.org or buildingmovement.org. You can download the report. It's free. You don't even have to put your name in. But I think, if you don't have a sense of discomfort, everything's working, if the whole system's working for you, why would you be unhappy in that system? Why wouldn't you want to work in that place in 3 years? That's a very common, across the board, that's a very common question that shows retention. Or why wouldn't you feel like you have a voice in the organization? The system is working for you. And then the minute you have those 1 to 4 strategies, boom, the white respondents are like, I don't like that. Like, what's happening? But I'll pass it to Mercedes about what goes on after that.
Yeah, I'll add on to this, and I'll try to connect the dots to our race equity assessment work, because I don't know to what extent we said this. I don't think we did. But Bessie, the race equity assessment, Building Blocks for Change, or BB4C for short, actually was spawned. It came out of our Race to Lead research after colleagues and peers in the field were really encouraging us to develop a tool that could really activate some of the findings and really make this make it accessible to nonprofits. But as I think about the 4, I'll call them pillars, but we refer to them as the key capacities or competency areas that organizations need to be strong in, regardless of whether or not they're pursuing equity, but again, especially if they are. Learning, leadership, conversation, and voice are the 4. The one that feels most relevant in this moment to Francis's response in your question is the area of conversation. It's our belief at BNP that the conversation capacity or competency is rooted in the idea that in order for an organization to make meaningful shifts in service of greater racial equity, they have to be able to have these challenging conversations within, even around this expected initial resistance, especially by, like, as you said, white staffs of organizations early on. And we fully anticipate, and we see it bear out in the findings for, pretty consistently across organizations. In fact, it's our early assessment that organizations who've taken the race equity assessment as part of our beta test, and even some early adopters since we launched publicly last year, that organizations have a lot of capacity that they need to build up in that conversation area. And part of what we see as we dig in, Frances is right. We look at everything from their intention to have conversations, so there's their aspirations, all the way through to the structural ways in which they embed conversations in. Sorry, the bubbles are coming up. Oh, I'll sit on my hands. And what we see is we look at everything from aspiration to the structural shifts in organizations. When it comes to questions that relate directly to race equity, we see, and we are able to disaggregate by race, we do see that initial tension bear out. And I remember earlier on when we were looking at individual reports, and then when we were sort of mining the larger data set, we were trying to better understand what the push-pull report, or excuse me, not push-pull, but what the Blocking the Backlash report actually named and found in the research, which is that initial rub. I was calling it the initial rub. It's like they got to push through it no matter what. So I'll say within organizations, we do see that bear out more anecdotally. We do, in the post conversations that we have with organizations about 6 to 12, and in some cases, 2 years out, that my colleague who works on the team with me and I have been having within organizations, they speak to that initial rub. They speak to that tension, that backlash they received across their employees, especially amongst white employees within the organization. And they speak to the shift in where they are 6 months to 2 years down the road, that they couldn't even have envisioned being at when they were initially kicking off their race equity assessment and some of their earlier strategies like training. So I'll just say that we tend to see that play out as well. And honestly, what combats it is the sort of, we had on the webinar that we had a few weeks back when we launched the report, we had a colleague who does DEI work in a big national organization that really put a stake in the ground around the way through it, is that we push. Our research shows it works. Our research also shows that there's initial tensions, but that in some ways we have to lift that up more and really stand our ground around the importance of it and push through it. And honestly, organizations, when we're looking for the secret sauce about how they broke through, sometimes they literally just say to us, Bessie, we kept going. We kept going, like we aligned around it and we pushed through. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I thought I'd just lift that up because I'm always surprised that there isn't something greater and what they're able to share. But I mean, I think that's great in and of itself, which is perseverance.
Yeah, no, and I love that because I think oftentimes, especially if you're in a leadership role, your inclination, if you get too much pushback, is to just stop the thing. And so for folks who want to go against the grain and just push through it, that kind of gives that validation and incentive that there's a light at the end of the tunnel if you actually keep going. Because it's contradictory to even what you learn in leadership models. You don't go against what your folks are saying to that degree. So if you're getting that sort of tension and you're not listening to it, it almost says that you're a bad leader. But that's not what this is showing.
I just realized that was on mute saying, yes, right. Yes, absolutely.
There's also, I mean, Mercedes has dealt with, and we certainly saw it in the response to the report, that there's just such a fear factor among the white leadership, and that like, why bring it up? Because it's going to explode the organization, or if you don't bring it up. And in a way, our findings show that, if you don't bring it up, if you don't have a DEI initiative, the white people are happy, but the people of color in that organization are really suffering. That's what I mean. It has real consequences for people of color that are not visible to white respondents and often to white leadership. And that's what we're really trying to lift up. You might not see it, but it's there.
There. Yeah, exactly.
that actually, I think, kind of segues a little bit into the push-pull report, because I think one of the interesting findings that I read there was this idea that folks of color are being pushed to lead instead of, what was it? Instead of being pulled into leadership, they're being pushed into leadership. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And I'll just note that also anecdotally in my circles and networks, like folks can identify with that. And then what we surfaced on the back end as well. But we found that, as you said, BIPOC respondents were more interested in leading nonprofit organizations as a result of a negative experience, directly or, in their observation, almost to serve as a more corrective, almost to serve to correct for what they observed and what they experienced more directly. And so that isn't necessary. We didn't necessarily see that they were being pulled into leadership by the more positive aspects of leading nonprofit organizations, alignment with the mission within the organization, the ability to lead change at a nonprofit organization in service of the organization's mission. All of the reasons that we can think over the course of our career that we've aspired to move into a leadership role, they're largely more positive. But our findings in the push-pull report actually lifted up that BIPOC respondents were actually responding alternatively to negative experiences. And one of the things I'll note here, if that is helpful, is we saw as their negative experiences increased, the more likely they were specifically to aspire to lead. And we can dive into some of the more specifics if that's helpful around specifically what drove that. One of the things I'll
yes,
call
please
out.
do.
Yeah, I'll call out this one because this was the biggest, which is around inadequate salaries. So just so that we name it, let's just throw it out on the rug. BIPOC respondents who were often or always facing challenges around inadequate salaries in their roles were more likely. I think we saw a pretty big gap, 18 percentage point gap when compared to BIPOC respondents who rarely or never faced inadequate salaries. They were more inclined to want to lead in organizations. And we didn't observe that type of gap or disparity when we looked at white respondents. I think there was only a 5 percentage point, and it actually might have gone in it did go up. It's in the same direction, but it's not that steep, right? It's not that significant. So that's certainly one area, but we looked at other areas as well, like the stress of being called upon to push or lead DEI initiatives within organizations. That's another area where we observed that challenge impacting and or pushing, I'll stop using my hands here, but pushing BIPOC respondents to want to lead within their nonprofit organizations as well. And we saw that as an 8 percentage point difference when we compared them to their counterparts who rarely or never face the stress of being pushed to lead DEI initiatives within their organization. And I'll just name anecdotally and what we've observed more qualitatively on the race equity assessment work at BNP is that tracks that so the back end of that white opposition that Frances named is often that we have BIPOC employees within the organizations who are champions, early adopters who are pushing the charge, but also expressing to us privately that's taxing, and that you're right. And they're often in middle and senior management roles within the organization, but we see that bearing out as well. So those are just a couple of examples of the specific challenges that we looked at and were able to observe their relationship between aspirations to lead for all respondents, but especially for BIPOC respondents. And Frances, feel free to jump in.
No, I think you described it beautifully. And unfortunately, getting support didn't make much of a difference. Even if when people were, especially people of color, were more supported, it didn't make them aspire to lead more. We had thought, well, maybe if you got a lot of support, you'd be more likely to aspire to lead. But that is not what we found. There were some differences, but not a lot. And one thing that's important to note is that having mentors at your job, people of color were less likely to have mentors at their job. And even when they had mentors, when they did not have mentors at their jobs, they were more likely to want to lead. And it kind of the opposite impact for white. If a white person had a mentor at the job, they were more likely to want to lead. So there's something about the mentorship within your organization, and you know how important that can be, even if it's not at your own organization. Somebody really developing your growth in the organization, those stretch assignments, those you can do more. I think that's another place where we're really failing. And I think the aspiration would be more of a pull if people could really be positively encouraged to lead, rather than feeling like they were there as a corrective to the negative things that had happened to them.
One of the things I also find interesting about the point that you brought up, Mercedes, around the stress of being called to lead DEI work is that is the, what are they called? Affinity groups are typically one of the default ways that folks do DEI specifically. So what do you think that means for that particular practice?
Yeah, and now Frances might want to hop in on because I know that was one of the strategies that we talked about, flipping back to push-pull, and I love this question, by the way, because we're actually interacting with it quite a bit, because affinity groups tend to be the containers or DEI work groups. Maybe they're not affinity because they cross races within the organizations and structures, but they oftentimes are the containers for the race equity assessment work in organizations. And we're seeing them shift a lot because of what you name. So one, I just want to name that what we hear anecdotally from leaders of color and staff of color on the front lines and nonprofits is that they're tired of carrying the weight of the DEI work within the organizations, and they tend to hold it in affinity groups in some ways. They also are naming that affinity groups per se aren't, because they are affinity groups by design, they don't tend to have that cross race within the group and cross positional power within the group that's actually needed to shift those practices and structures within the organizations. We're beginning to hear some of the organizations who are engaging with our race equity assessment questioning the effectiveness of the affinity group beyond just building community, which is critical within the organization too. So this is not to rag on affinity groups, but we're just hearing more organizations speak to the need to have something that's cross-racial within the organization, that cuts across positions and levels within the organization, to really not hold, because it's really the broader organization's responsibility, right, to shift towards equity, but to really center and guide and facilitate and steward that work. And so we're just seeing more pushback around the affinity groups. And I just remember when they were all the rave, right? That, just having a space. I just remember the time when you didn't have a space that was named and codified where you could talk about issues impacting you, like race, within the organization. But we're just starting to see a little bit. And again, this is more anecdotally. I'll be clear that we haven't seen this in our research per se, but we're starting to interact with that a little bit more as we think about what does the ongoing race equity assessment work look like within the organization.
And it's true that it's in terms of effectiveness. When we ask, most people think the different DEI strategies are effective, but when we asked about extremely or very effective, affinity groups were one of the lower got the lower response rate. Not that people didn't like them; fewer people were in them of the respondents. But the things that really, especially for people of color, that made a difference in terms of strategy was like recruiting senior and executive leadership of diverse backgrounds, measuring and tracking organizational diversity, addressing how racial equity and systemic bias impact the organization and the issues that it works on. So those were the things that, especially for people of color, made a big, that they rated as effective and very and extremely effective.
So it's not surprising that folks would want more folks of color being recruited into leadership positions, right? And how do you reconcile that with one of your findings in the push-pull report is that leaders of color are less reported by staff. And that was not the first report that y'all reported that in, because that was one of the most interesting finding. I think it was the Glass Cliff one that I read it in.
Yeah.
So this is a consistent finding that you have.
Yeah, well, that's all staff too. But remember, people of color are the ones that the senior leadership, 58% of people of color respondents say that that's a very effective strategy, but that's compared to only 47%, less than half of the white respondents. So, but yeah, there's no question that when executive directors get into that job, they are less supported by staff than white leaders. They're less supported by boards than white leaders report. And what's also interesting, Bessie, is that when leaders of color come into the position, they have less board support. They have less support from former executive directors. They have less support all the way around, except in executive coaching. That is a big exception than white respondents. And that was in the push-pull report. And you're right, that's consistent. We did that because of the glass ceilings, Glass Cliff report. We wanted to continue to look at those issues. I think we added a few extra issues even in 2022. And that, so we still don't have a good sense of what it's like to onboard a leader of color. And then it's not surprising that leaders of color are leaving because they're burned out. And, we asked why, if people were considering leaving or had already planned to leave, why? And 41% of the leaders of color said it was because of burnout, and that was far less than the white leadership. So I think there's kind of some real consistencies there, and we really have not addressed that. So there's one thing about getting a leader of color into the position, which was our first question, right? And now it's like once, and you could speak to this as a leader of color, once you're in that position, what are the supports that are needed so that you're not burnt out and tasked with correcting everything that wasn't done before?
Mercedes, do you want to add?
Yeah, no, actually, it was just echoing what and sort of ditto to what Frances said. And I think one thing that was, and Frances, I appreciate you lifting up the burnout piece too, because like that is critical. I was just reflecting on one of the qualitative quotes from our report, which really the BIPOC leader lifted up this sentiment that they're the right person to lead the organization at the right time. And that leadership is a huge function of their role, but really sort of spoke to eloquently, and I won't read it here, but really that tension between making sure the organization is doing meaningful, values-aligned work and recognizing the inability to lead the organization in the way in which it needs to be led, right? Just due to a number of competing priorities, as well as exactly what Frances named around the lack of support across the board within the organization. So it's no wonder that you would see so much turnover and burnout being cited as that amongst BIPOC leaders within organizations. And Bessie, to your earlier comment about feeling seen in our data, I was around the time that the Glass Cliff report came out and really again with the push-pull, I was just observing a lot of colleagues and peers leave CEO and executive director roles who were, particularly women of color during that time, and just anecdotally remember having conversations with colleagues across the country, but why is this happening? And specifically when I observed someone in my network who was in that situation. And so it was very interesting to see us dig into that with our surveys and through our research, and really elevate especially the quotes that we heard directly from BIPOC leaders, and they really align with what I was hearing. And so I just want to name that.
So we're coming up on time. So what would you want folks to take away from your reports?
I'll let you start, Frances, and then I'll hop in.
Sure. First of all, when we first did the Race to Lead surveys, I did it with my co-executive director, John Thomas Breitfeld, and one day we were comparing presentation. We were presenting all over the country, and we kind of were in the office the same day. We were comparing notes, and he said, he's a Black man, and he said, it's funny, every time I present, a white man gets up and says, how do you know your data is valid? And Sean is like, okay, it's the largest survey of staff that's ever been done in the nonprofit sector, and he's questioning me on the validity of the survey. And I said, that's so funny. As a white woman, older white woman, right? Like, you know what's coming. As an older white woman, what happens is there's usually a woman of color who stands up and says, why do I need data to validate what we've been saying for years? Both of those things really exemplify the problem that we've had, that the resistance of white people to acknowledge what's happening in our world and in our organizations, and that they have the ability to do something about it. Instead of being defensive, you actually can make some changes. But also that we have not been listening to what people of color have been saying, and it took data to elevate this to a reality when it's been the reality for so many people for so long. And I guess what I want is for us to understand that you don't always have to have the data. The data is I'm not against data. I do data, And the only reason we knew how to do the data was because we were listening to people, and we said, yeah, let's put some data behind this. So we have to listen to people's experience, and that's why we developed the race equity assessment. It's like we have to be listening to people in our organizations. People complain, everybody complains, but there's something beyond that we sometimes ignore because we don't want to hear it. So that's my wish, is that we listen and validate what people's lived experience really is.
Yeah, and I think in the spirit of that, Frances, just thinking about flipping back to the Blocking the Backlash report, what we heard in that report, especially from respondents of color, is that these DEI initiatives and race equity initiatives in organizations do make a difference, and especially to staff of color in organizations. And the findings from the report lifted up in the report from the data overall affirm the importance and the effectiveness of DEI efforts in nonprofit organizations, especially, again, I'm just going to double down on that, for staff of color in the organization. And we observed and talked about the shift that as the org goes deeper, we start to see even in resistant white employees of the organization. The data also shows that DEI, as we talked about, is a starting point, not the end all be all, and the importance of supporting organizations more structurally and building the structure across the system. If we think about the system of care that supports the nonprofit organizations to really push through this moment. I mean, I want to double down on this just because, again, the work that I lead at the organization is in a very interesting spot. When we launched the development of the assessment years ago, I think organizations couldn't get to DEI and race equity work fast enough, right? They were trying to beat one another. Now we see a little bit of retreating happening in some spaces. So I would encourage organizations who I know, as Frances said, are already interested to sort of push through and sort of block it out like the report suggests. But I would call on our stakeholders who are in positions to be able to alleviate some of that tension that nonprofits who are aligned are feeling, to really think about their role and strengthening the work to dismantle those structural barriers, investing in DEI initiatives for smaller nonprofits in particular who are really ready to stay the course, but are without the resources to bring on the skilled experts to help them resist the push through the tensions within the organization as well as outside of the organizations, because organizations don't just face internal threats, they face external threats depending on which state or pocket of which state they're located in. They can receive funding threats, especially if they're drawing down public funding with all of the threats in the public space as well. So I just want to implore folks across the system, especially those who are leading work and are funding efforts across the country, to recognize that nonprofits need more direct support from us to resist the pushback in this time.
Thank you for that. I know, Frances, you said this, but where can folks find you online?
www.racetolead.org has all our Race to Lead reports, And you can also find them on our main website, which is buildingmovement.org. We're the Building Movement Project, www.buildingmovement.org. And feel free to reach out to us for other things, for questions, to Mercedes, if you're interested in the assessment, or for any of the data that we have and how it can be used.
Yeah, I wanted to add, if that's okay, Bessie, that folks interested in learning more about the assessment, to Frances's point, can reach out to Building Blocks for change.org to learn more about our race equity assessment.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining me today.
But thank you for having us, Bessie.
Keep up with everything going on at Alternatives, or to donate, you can visit us at our website, alternativesyouth.org. You can also follow us at Alternatives Inc. on Instagram or at Alternatives Youth on Facebook. If you want to keep up with Bessie, you can follow her on Instagram and TikTok at Bessie_Alcantara. Thanks for listening.